When a nation finally wins its political independence, the flags are raised, the parades march, sovereignty is declared.
It's this huge moment of triumph.
Exactly. But when all that dust settles, what happens if, behind that triumphant political facade, the actual economic lifeblood, the essential political direction of that newly freed country, what if it's still being controlled entirely from outside?
That is the central question, isn't it? It defines so much of the last half-century of global power struggles.
And today, we're undertaking a deep dive into the profound and, to be honest, revolutionary analysis of these post-colonial power dynamics. We're looking at Kwame Nkrumah's foundational 1965 work, Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism.
And Nkrumah, as a giant of African independence and Ghana's first president, he understood this transition intimately. He lived it.
He really did. He dedicated this book to the freedom fighters of Africa, living and dead. So we are drawing directly from his introduction and the key chapters, the ones detailing Africa's immense resources, the systemic economic and financial obstacles put in their way, and the really intricate role of global finance in maintaining this state of dependency.
Yeah, the mechanics of it.
Right. Our mission for you, the listener, is clear. We want to move beyond just the definition. We want to extract the essential technical components of Nkrumah's argument. We'll try to help you understand the precise financial and political mechanisms he identified, and then illustrate them with the specific data he was using over half a century ago.
It's a shortcut, really. A comprehensive shortcut to grasping this really complex historical and economic concept.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
What's so fascinating here is that Nkrumah doesn't see this as, a series of separate problems. He posits neo-colonialism as imperialism and its final and perhaps its most dangerous stage.
Its final stage.
Yes, it's an evolution. A comprehensive economic system designed specifically to ensure the continuation of exploitation long after the formal colonial administration has packed its bags and gone home.
So it looks different, but the core function is the same.
Exactly. He states that the essence of this new form of control is that the state is subject, in theory, to all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. It looks independent. It has a seat at the UN.
That's a flag.
It has a flag, but in reality, he says, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. And that control is just. It's comprehensive. So the central question it raises is absolutely critical for understanding global economics today.
Which is?
How is this profound level of control actually exercised without the overt presence of traditional colonial soldiers or governors? It's a subtle but, a devastating transition from that visible dominion to a kind of hidden financial mastery.
That subtlety is really the key, isn't it? And Nkrumah argues old-fashioned colonialism is, it's effectively abolished. It's just too politically costly to maintain in the post-war world.
Right, the optics are terrible.
Exactly. So the new process involves keeping the territory nominally independent, but you're exchanging that direct political annexation for a really sophisticated system of economic manipulation. The goal is to maximize the exploitation while minimizing any external political liability.
So how do they do it? How do the imperial powers, as he calls them, ensure this control without a physical army on the ground?
Well, he outlines several pretty clear methods of economic coercion. The neo-colonial state is often obliged, for instance, to prioritize the manufactured products of the imperialist power.
Ah, so you have to buy from them.
You have to buy from them, and specifically to the exclusion of competing products from elsewhere. And on top of that, external control is often exerted through monetary means tying local currencies to the former metropole, or by direct payments towards the running costs of the state itself.
Like paying the bills for the government. Essentially, yes. Including providing foreign civil servants or, experts placed in these crucial positions. Think about the central bank or the finance ministry, places where they can dictate policy from the inside.
And this is precisely why Nkrumah calls neo-colonialism the worst form of imperialism. He argues, and this is a direct quote, that the neo-colonialist wields power without responsibility, and for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress.
Power without responsibility. That's a powerful phrase.
It is. Think about it. In the old days, the people could identify the colonial governor. They could see the imperial power. They had a clear target for their protests and their resistance.
You knew who the enemy was.
Exactly. But under neo-colonialism, who do you sue? The exploiter is hidden behind this complex web. A consortium, an opaque offshore bank, or some clause buried in a supposedly benign aid agreement. This lack of accountability, this power without responsibility, it makes seeking justice virtually impossible for the people on the ground. That makes the struggle against it just inherently more frustrating. But Nkrumah highlights an even darker danger that this system introduces, the facilitation of limited wars. Why would financial control lead to actual conflict?
Well, it's because of the global power structure that was set up after World War II. You have the development of nuclear weapons by the great power blocs, the whole Cold War context, and that effectively imposed a constraint.
Right, mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. It prevented the threat of a total world war. But that restraint didn't eliminate imperial competition, it just shifted it. It actually allowed for intense competition in these small, strategically important, independent neo-colonial states.
The battlefield moved.
A battlefield moved to the periphery.
Yeah.
And Nkrumah cites the one in South Vietnam as a really stark example. That conflict escalated not just because of organic local dynamics, but directly because of great power involvement. They were propping up a fragile neo-colonial regime with financial and military backing.
So the conflict becomes localized, a limited war, but the consequences are magnified by these outside powers.
Magnified exponentially. This allows the great powers to fight proxy wars without risking their own nuclear annihilation, making the neo-colonial states the primary battleground for their competition.
So the lack of accountability, combined with this shifting nature of great power rivalry, makes any newly independent state incredibly vulnerable. And the source material notes that this system was strategically established by the former colonial powers right after WWII, during that transition away from overt colonial rule.
Absolutely. And they needed political cover for it. This development was partly concealed by the rhetoric of the welfare state back home in the rich countries.
How does that connect?
Well, historically, colonial profits largely flowed into the pockets of the capitalist and land-owning classes. But in the post-war era, many of these profits now extracted through these new mechanisms of neo-colonialism were, in part, routed to placate the working classes in those rich countries.
This is a deliberate policy.
A very deliberate policy. The powers diverted some of these colonial earnings to finance their own domestic welfare states, which stabilized their own societies while they were still drawing the fundamental wealth from the newly independent world.
Which brings us directly to the concept of aid, a concept which Nkrumah describes not as generosity, but as a profoundly dangerous trap, a new means of competition. He says it's often granted by rival individual developed states, leading to, neo-colonial rivalry.
Yeah.
But if Africa desperately needs infrastructure and heavy capital, why is Nkrumah so suspicious of aid? I mean, isn't some external funding necessary for these vital national projects?
The problem, according to Nkrumah, is the structure of the aid, not the concept itself. Bilateral aid, so aid from a single donor country, is almost always conditional. It's what he calls tied aid.
Tied aid?
Yes. It serves the specific vested interests of the donor. It guarantees them markets and cheap raw materials. For instance, the money granted might only be permitted to be used to buy manufactured goods from the donor country. Or to hire specific, very high-cost technicians from the donor country. Or even to charter their shipping. This immediately sends a huge portion of that aid money right back out of the recipient state. It ends up funding jobs and industries back in the metropole.
So the money isn't really intended to build up, say, Ghana or Nigeria's local industrial capacity. It's actually intended to subsidize and support manufacturing jobs in France or the United States, all while creating the appearance of generosity.
Exactly. And this is why Nkrumah points out that multilateral aid from organizations like the UN is often actively resisted or complicated by these neo-colonial powers.
Because it comes with fewer strings attached.
Far fewer. Multilateral aid usually gives the receiving state much more autonomy over its expenditures. It might allow them to, say, build a local processing plant for their own raw materials.
Which would be direct competition.
Direct competition. That local processing plant would directly challenge and frustrate the vested interests of the metropolitan power, which relies on Africa shipping out raw materials and then buying back the finished goods. The goal of tied bilateral aid is dependency, not genuine self-sufficiency.
That incredible contrast, then, between this vast resource potential and the crushing poverty, that is the defining symptom of neo-colonialism. So let's move to Nkrumah's central illustration of the problem from his chapter on Africa's resources.
The paradox.
Yes, the paradox of incredible continental wealth coexisting with pervasive poverty. It just perfectly highlights neo-colonialism in action. So lay out the scale for us. What kind of resources does Nkrumah say Africa actually holds?
I mean, the statistics are just staggering, and they're crucial to his argument. Africa is ridiculously rich. Its estimated iron ore reserves are put at twice the size of America's reserves. Twice. It has vast coal reserves estimated to last for 300 years. And crucially, it has more than 40% of the world's potential water power, a greater share than any other continent, which is essential for industrialization. Its forest areas are also twice as great as those of the United States.
Okay, so the potential is almost limitless.
Almost limitless. And yet, despite this enormous wealth potential, Africa, with a population of about 280 million at the time, accounted for only 2% of the world's total industrial production.
Just 2%.
That tiny 2% figure is the evidence of what he calls economic maladjustment. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the African economies were deliberately kept focused on primary production. The source material shows that in the late 1950s, Africa contributed 47% of its total economic activity to primary products, agriculture, and mining.
And in the U.S.?
Only 4%. And while Nkrumah does note that per capita output had increased rapidly, it was up 60% in the last period of expansion, the profits remained highly concentrated in small urban areas. The benefits just did not trickle down to the majority rural population.
That makes me wonder about the actual workers on the ground. I mean, if output is increasing that 60%, why couldn't the newly independent government just step in? Nationalize the mines or mandate higher wages? Surely that increase in value could be captured domestically.
That's a critical question, and it really speaks to the limitations that are placed on a neo-colonial state. Nkrumah emphasizes the poverty of the worker in these rich resource zones. Mining profits are huge, but the wages for African workers are notoriously low. Often they're paid less than half the actual value they produce.
And the rest?
The majority of that huge revenue stays in the pockets of the wealthy directors who are residing in the metropolitan cities. So if a local government did attempt to nationalize or mandate fair wages, the financial mechanisms that the monopolies will discuss later, they would retaliate. By freezing credit, imposing trade embargoes, or manipulating commodity prices to make the whole operation economically unviable. The state is structurally dependent. It can't easily seize control of its own production.
The source material gives some, as you said, staggering specific evidence of this extraction, particularly from the Congo, which was then Leopoldville during this period. Can you walk us through those specific numbers? They really illustrate the pure volume of what was being taken out.
Absolutely. Looking at Congo from 1945 to 1959, the figures are almost unbelievable. Diamond exports jumped from about 5.5 million carats to nearly 15 million carats, 14,854,000 carats to be precise. And copper exports rose from 1.6 million tons to over 7.1 million tons. This sheer volume of wealth extraction far, far exceeded the domestic product and any investment in local infrastructure. It was fundamentally enriching external interests, primarily through the company Union Minière de Haute-Katanga.
And the local government got what?
Minimal royalties, while the vast majority of the profit was immediately expatriated, sent straight out of the country.
And we see this pattern repeating across agricultural exports as well, which makes the cocoa case study so powerful. Ghana and Nigeria were producing dramatically more cocoa, yet the profits weren't staying in Accra or Lagos.
Precisely. Nkrumah analyzes this massive production increase. Ghana went from 248,000 long tons of cocoa in the late 40s to an estimated 590,000 tons by 1964. Nigeria also saw these huge production increases.
But despite this stupendous output,
the producer price was controlled by global monopolies, the big chocolate manufacturers and the commodity brokers in the developed countries. They set the price.
can you put a number on that exploitation?
He does. While Ghana and Nigeria together received about 125 million pounds for their total cocoa production in a key period, the developed countries, who merely processed and marketed it, they pocketed an estimated 77 million pounds of profit just from Ghana's production alone.
So more than half the value was captured after it left the farm.
That margin, the difference between the price paid to the farmer and the price the chocolate company sold the finished good for, that is the pure wealth drain. The power to dictate the price of these cash crops is the first crucial lever of neo-colonial control. It ensures that the benefits are reaped by those farthest from the farm.
So if the inability to industrialize is the core problem, then Africa is paying this huge price for the profit transfer. How does the neo-colonial system actively block a country from building its own manufacturing base?
Well, any attempt by an African country to establish its own manufacturing or processing industries risks undercutting the profits that are being drawn from primary exports by these imperialist monopolies. Newmar argues that the foreign interests will invest in the infrastructure that's necessary for extraction, railways to the port, basic power for the mine site.
But not for anything else.
But they actively refuse investment that would create competition for their own exports.
And Nigeria in the 1960s serves as a perfect structural example of this restriction.
Look at the data. Nigeria was generating 63% of its economic activity from agriculture, forestry, and fishing primary products. Meanwhile, industry, manufacturing, and commerce combined accounted for only 12%.
And the source contest attributes this maladjustment.
Not to a lack of potential, but directly to foreign interests exploiting its iron and oil resources. It specifically mentions Shell BP as a major oil exporter that was controlling the bulk of the profits.
And the arrangements they dictated are instructive here.
Very. Even the oil refinery that was going up in Port Harcourt, which was owned by Shell BP, only handled 10% of Nigeria's crude oil output. And its products were sold only to the Nigerian domestic market.
So it's capped.
It was intentionally capped. This arrangement restricts the vast majority of production to be channeled outside of the country for processing and sale in Europe. This kind of arrangement, which intentionally limits domestic refining capacity and market potential, is precisely the mechanism of neo-colonialism. Nigeria's economic life, its true potential for integrated industrial growth, was sacrificed for the larger capital provisions and profit margins demanded by foreign interests.
So if economic restriction through price control and limited industrialization is one lever, Nkrumah moves from there to what is really the ultimate checkmate: the political division of the continent itself. Move on from resources, we have to examine the political and financial structures designed to keep the continent fragmented. He identified this as a fundamental obstacle to any progress.
Yes, political fragmentation, or balkanization, as it's often called.
Balkanization is a key concept here. The UN Economic Commission for Africa noted that Africa was divided into 19 independent states plus others, which makes central continental economic planning virtually impossible.
You can't coordinate.
You can't. Nkrumah argues this division prevents African countries from achieving economic self-sufficiency because these small states lack the scale for heavy industry and are just easily dominated one by one. But how was this fragmentation achieved, particularly in French Africa?
The mechanism of balkanization was institutionalized, and France was a master of it. The case study of French neo-colonialism via the Loi Cadre of 1956 is essential to understand.
The Loi Cadre.
Yes. Before this law, French West and Equatorial Africa were administered as two vast federations. The Loi Cadre dismantled them. It created 12 separate, smaller autonomous republics. And while the referendum of 1958 allowed some to become nominally independent, the conditions strictly tied them to the French community and, critically, to the French financial system.
And this is where the financial control comes in, through aid and the franc zone. This is where we need to get a bit technical.
We do. The aid given by France to these African states was absolutely conditional. It was deeply rooted in securing French financial interests. It secured guaranteed captive markets for French manufactured products, and it guaranteed primary products for French industry coffee, groundnuts, cotton, often at below market prices.
So the aid was essentially a subsidy for French business.
Exactly. It ensured the French financial relationship remained profitable for French taxpayers and businesses.
So Nkrumah isn't just talking about a currency peg here. He's talking about a total control mechanism that's embedded in the very structure of the franc zone. Can you elaborate on the technical requirements of this system?
It was absolute control. The funds of these French neo-colonial African states were governed by the administrative council of their central banks. But, and this is the key, this council was composed partly of Frenchmen, sometimes even a majority, without whose agreement no decision on monetary or financial policy could be taken.
So France effectively retained a veto power.
A veto over the monetary sovereignty of these nations. And what's more fascinating is the mechanism of their reserves. France held their foreign exchange reserves. These African countries were required to keep their funds in the French treasury.
Wow.
This complex system meant that while they were theoretically independent, they were subject to immediate external pressures. If a country attempted to withdraw its own funds or pursue an independent financial policy, its weak financial position immediately became visible to France, subjecting them to political pressure or capital flight orchestrated by external interests. It was, simply put, debt and monetary bondage, designed to ensure policy alignment with Paris.
And we see similar structures elsewhere, though maybe less centralized than the franc zone. How did the British system compare in maintaining this kind of control?
We can look at British examples like Rhodesia and Libya to see some variation. Rhodesia represented what he called a fossilized form of this. The local white ruling class exercised the economic exploitation, but under the umbrella of British protection.
So the exploitation was maintained, but the political burden of direct colonial administration was reduced.
Precisely. And Libya's case shows aid being used to pay for military bases which served British strategic interests. Libya was nominally independent, yet Britain's aid was largely used as a transfer payment to secure the continued presence of British military forces on Libyan soil.
So the aid wasn't for development at all.
No, it wasn't designed to foster Libyan development. It was to secure British strategic positioning in the Mediterranean. It was a payment for continued military access, masking strategic control as development assistance.
And this all ties back to Nkrumah's fundamental solution, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Thor's context stresses that only by achieving a unified economy, one capable of meeting continental needs, Pan-African unity, can neo-colonialism be effectively countered.
Absolutely. The economic argument for unity is overwhelming. Nkrumah details that if Africa's vast resources, like its potash, its nitrogenous fertilizer production, or that 40% of the world's water power, if they were developed collectively, the economic power would shift dramatically.
Yeah. Because smaller states just can't afford the capital outlay.
They can't afford the heavy capital outlay required for these large industrial projects. The source gives a specific, practical example of this. The power required for a sugar refinery in Bangui would require cooperation between the Central African Republic and others, because Bangui can't afford the heavy capital needed for such industrial projects on its own.
They were designed to be dependent.
African economies were designed to be complementary to the colonial economy producing raw materials for the metropole. So to become self-sufficient, they must reorganize their economies regionally, coordinating industrial centers and supply chains continentally to avoid that external dependence. Without this unity, Nkrumah concludes, the neo-colonial forces will just continue to seize the opportunities created by this continental division.
To truly understand the engine that's driving all of this, we have to look back at its historical roots, the rise of modern finance. Nkrumah ties neo-colonialism directly to classical analysis, specifically to Lenin's analysis from 1916, which defined imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. What exactly did that entail?
Well, Lenin argued that this stage is characterized by the fusion of industrial and finance capital into these vast monopolies, trusts, cartels, syndicates that aggressively compete for the world's raw materials and markets. Nkrumah takes that framework and he updates it to the post-World War II context.
Right. He details the post-war power shifts. The failure of the interwar intervention to subdue the Soviet Union created a new geopolitical situation, but the competitive pressure of capitalism, that remained.
It just changed its focus.
Exactly. After WWII, there was a bitter struggle for hegemony between the traditional European powers, primarily Britain and Germany, and the United States, which emerged as the undisputed leading force in international finance.
And the rise of the American dollar was central to this shift. American financial power surged dramatically. It drove investment into Africa and the developing world, and it often overrode the traditional European spheres of influence.
The scale of it was huge.
The source notes the dramatic scale. American private foreign investment in Africa was only about $150 million pre-war. By 1962, it had surged to $789 million. The U.S. successfully displaced traditional European finance and became the primary neo-colonial actor, using its financial strength to secure resources and markets globally.
And if we connect this to the mechanism of control?
Monopolies control production, prices, and supply chains globally. For the developing world, this means they are forced to sell their raw materials cheaply, often through price-fixing agreements, and then buy back expensive manufactured goods, resulting in chronic indebtedness. Nkrumah argued this chronic debt cycle is a key mechanism for maintaining control. When commodity prices fluctuate, a small state is always forced to borrow perpetually just to keep pace, which only deepens its structural dependency.
Let's use the Alcan example from the book to illustrate this financial chokehold. How does one corporation prevent an entire nation from building a viable industry based on its own raw materials?
The Aluminium Company of Canada, Alcan, serves as a perfect structural example of monopoly control over vital resources like bauxite. Alcan, after acquiring British firms, dominated bauxite production across its territories. And the mechanism is simple but devastating.
What did they do?
Alcan controlled the bauxite production. They kept selling prices high for their own refined product globally while restricting output and processing facilities locally to maintain that profitability.
So they prevented the value-added step from happening locally.
Exactly. By restricting the ability to convert bauxite into aluminum, the high-value process, Alcan completely stifled the growth of aluminum industries in resource-rich nations like Ghana, which was a major bauxite producer. This ensures that the primary value-added industrial function is reserved for the monopolies in Canada, not for the country supplying the raw material. The local economy just remains stuck at the extraction stage, unable to capture the value created by processing.
And furthermore, the nature of these financial consortia ensures that the exploitation is systematic and widespread. It's not reliant on a single bad actor, it's systemic. It relies on a coalition of financial giants.
That's right. The financial giants operate through consortia, Rockefeller, Morgan, British, German banks, to exploit the continent's natural resources. This collaboration, even among competing national interests, ensures that the wealth is extracted for their own private gain, not for the development of the region. They use their vast capital resources to preserve their monopolies and control markets, actively discouraging any local industry that might compete or devote resources from that primary purpose of extraction.
Which leads to this illusion of self-help, where the newly independent state looks like it is taking control, but is actually still dancing to the financial giant's tune.
Precisely. Even when African states establish their own central monetary institutions, which looks like a huge step toward sovereignty, these institutions often remain subservient to the policies of the international banking system, which is controlled by these imperialist monopolies. These institutions, Nkrumah argues, are like an empty parade of associates placed in front of a system that's already controlled by the financial giants, like the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve. They have autonomy in name only.
This is maybe the most difficult aspect of neocolonialism to grasp, the hidden linkages. The invisible empire. The source context emphasizes the need to look deeper, behind the headlines of company reports or bank acquisitions, to understand the true connections between what seem like disparate announcements.
Yes, the interlocking oligarchy.
Exactly. How does this small circle of individuals holding multiple directorships across major banks and companies globally manage to coordinate control across continents and even competing national interests?
This is where Nkrumah really shines a light on the technical structures of financial capital. The unity of financial capital is maintained not by treaty, but by personnel. The source details how directors of the big five British banks, for example, held over 1,000 directorships, 1,008 positions, across 299 financial and industrial institutions.
So the same people are on all the boards.
The same people. This interlocking ensures policy alignment. A person sitting on the board of a major bank also sits on the board of a major mining company. This ensures that the bank's lending policies support the mining company's extractive interests and actively discourage any competitive local ventures.
Let's look at the integration of Morgan Grenfell and Société Générale to show how this collaboration works across national lines.
It's a perfect example. Morgan Grenfell, which is British, participated in the African banking group. Société Générale, which is French, held interests in banks across West Africa, Senegal, Congo, Cameroon. This integration allowed the powerful Morgan interests to extend their financial reach into territories formerly controlled by France.
So it shows that even supposedly competing financial groups collaborate.
They collaborate to exploit the continent collectively. The financial columns in the newspaper report this as a simple merger, but it is, in reality, a consolidation of coordinated control over vital regions, ensuring resources flow to Western industry regardless of which nation formally owned the colony.
The ultimate synthesis of this control is often found in individuals themselves, who serves as Nkrumah's key case study for this integration of finance and extraction.
That would be Harry F. Oppenheimer. He dominated the financial scene in South Africa through the Anglo-American Group. Oppenheimer controlled this sprawling network of companies mining, so diamonds, gold, copper, but also chemical and financial services.
And crucially, he was on the bank boards.
Yes. Crucially, he held directorships in major banks like Standard Bank and Midland Bank, ensuring these close ties between finance and resource exploitation across all of Southern Africa. His interests were explicitly linked to Rothschilds and other major international financial players. It created a powerful oligarchy that transcended national boundaries, dedicated solely to abstracting wealth and stabilizing markets in favor of its shareholders.
And this coordinated effort facilitated that massive American expansion post-WWII, too. U.S. private foreign investment grew exponentially, directed strategically towards mining and raw material processing. This was a calculated effort to secure resources for U.S. industry, often overriding the traditional European spheres of influence.
Exactly. And the consequence of this financial oligarchy is the complete vulnerability of small states. The case study of Liberia's debt history is just a chilling demonstration of how financial control can dominate a state. And this is a nation that had been independent since 1847.
100 years of independence, and still not sovereign.
Not financially. Liberia was repeatedly subject to financial control through debt. In 1926, to secure a loan from the American Firestone Rubber Company, Liberia was forced to accept a condition where an American receiver general gained power over its customs, its tariffs, and its debt servicing.
So an American official was controlling Liberia's entire revenue stream.
Effectively, yes, ensuring repayment to American interests. This mechanism maintained financial sovereignty through debt, even a century after nominal independence. It just highlights how an international financial oligarchy, disguised as loans or investments, can achieve what colonial armies no longer could: complete control over a state's fiscal policy and its long-term economic decisions. Financial capital, as Nkrumah concluded, does not want liberty, it wants domination.
Moving into the specific resources that were being targeted, Chapter 6 underscores the long-term strategy. American and European companies, connected to the world's most powerful banking institutions, all consented to exploit new sources of primary products in the developing world through these long-term arrangements.
And this aggressive search for resources was driven by the sheer scale of industrial demand.
Right. The source material shows the global output of crude steel doubled between 1950 and 1960. Global demands for raw materials drive this Western interest in Africa, and surveys just kept confirming Africa's vast, untapped reserves of iron ore, manganese, uranium, and other critical minerals.
This raises an important question then. Which resources are the most contested and by whom? The source material details this precisely. Iron ore and manganese are of high importance for steel production. For instance, iron ore reserves in Senegal and Mauritania are exploited by powerful French and Anglo-American groups.
And manganese in the Congo?
Controlled by Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, which also dominates copper and other minerals in that whole region.
And what about phosphates?
Also strategically essential, particularly for agriculture and fertilizer production worldwide. North Africa is noted as the world's greatest producer of phosphates, with Morocco being a colossal source. American, Belgian, and German companies invested heavily in exploiting these reserves. It confirms the pattern. Foreign investment concentrates heavily in extraction rather than comprehensive domestic development that would serve local needs. The profit margins are guaranteed by controlling the source.
And then, of course, there are the strategically vital resources, uranium and petroleum. These are subject to intense international rivalry. This isn't just about making steel anymore. This is about military and energy security for the West.
Precisely. We see the struggle over strategic minerals exemplified by the French, Belgian, and German consortium that was controlling manganese, uranium, and nickel in Gabon. It was known as Comilog.
So a multinational consortium?
Exactly. It illustrates the strategic importance of these resources and the foreign, multinational control exerted over them. The struggle over uranium and oil fields involves major international players trying to secure long-term, reliable supplies, often overriding any political considerations.
This competition was so intense that the U.S. was reportedly concerned when France sent paratroopers to quell an uprising in Gabon in 1964. Why would the U.S. care about a French colonial action in Gabon?
Because political stability is directly tied to securing the resource flow. The ultimate aim of these interests is simple: to ensure a reliable, cheap supply of raw materials for the Western industrial machine. They often prioritize the stability of a puppet regime over fair economic returns or democratic processes for the producing countries.
So the fact that the U.S. paid attention.
The fact that the U.S. paid attention to a French military action in a small West African state confirms that the stakes were global. They were protecting the global supply chain, which was controlled by their interconnected financial oligarchy.
So the conclusion of the resource analysis in the source material is devastatingly clear.
It is. North Africa is the world's greatest producer of phosphates, while Southern Africa dominates in gold, chromium, and uranium. The pattern remains structurally fixed. Resources critical to developed nations are extensively exploited and controlled by international consortia, fundamentally perpetuating the state of underdevelopment. The profits from these critical resources are constantly being drained from the developing world, ensuring the economic gap between rich and poor nations only deepens.
We've thoroughly mapped out Nkrumah's blistering critique of the post-independence world. Neo-colonialism replaces overt political rule with this intricate financial and economic control. The mechanisms are complex and surgical, political balkanization to prevent collective bargaining power.
Manipulative tied aid and monetary zones that ensure structural dependency through fixed parity and reserve control.
And the consolidation of power through these interlocking global financial monopolies that extract resources while actively suppressing any local industrial development.
But it's a complete system.
It is. And for you, the listener, this deep dive shows that achieving political independence is only the first step. Nkrumah's analysis demonstrates that the true, enduring struggle lies not on the battlefield, but in dismantling the invisible economic structures, the banking rules, the commodity cartels, the debt covenants that keep the resources flowing outward and the financial control centered far away in the metropolitan countries. It's a perpetual struggle against an invisible empire that requires a complete overhaul of global economic thinking.
The source material consistently shows that neocolonialism is not a passive outcome of underdevelopment. It is an actively managed policy system. It functions through the ability of the financial oligarchy to maintain a monopoly over production, to control commodity prices, and to ensure that aid is merely a sophisticated tool of foreign investment. The inherent economic logic of competition and profit maximization forces these monopolies to keep the developing world dependent, ensuring that the wealth created stays with the shareholders in the richest nations.
And we have seen how the struggle against neocolonialism is fundamentally the struggle for economic power, and that Pan-African unity that Newcomb championed as the only viable defense.
And we've seen how the struggle relies on constant conflict and competition, the U.S. versus Europe, the dollar versus the franc, to create these opportunities for exploitation. Now, here is a provocative thought for you to carry forward.
Okay.
If Nkrumah's analysis holds, and if the global financial networks rely on instability in the periphery to thrive, what happens if the developing nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America were to successfully coordinate their monetary policy, nationalize key resources collectively, and develop their own regional industrial capacity, thereby eliminating the competition Nkrumah described? Think about how the very nature of global capitalism today, in the era of digital finance and accelerated globalization, continues to rely on these financial structures developed over half a century ago, and what it would truly take to break the chains of financial mastery.